fed once a day, as far as I could tell, a little watery soup, occasionally a slice of bread. And the thing that struck me most is that they were eating grass and mixing that with the soup. They were so desperate.
Wenn sie nicht gewollt gewesen wäre, dann hätte man doch uns Hilfe von außen zukommen lassen können. Wir hatten keinerlei Verbindung mit der Außenwelt. Wir durften nicht schreiben. Es durfte niemand zu uns kommen, geschweige denn das Internationale Rote Kreuz. Ich war damals immerhin auch schon einigermaßen im internationalen Geschäft erfahren. Mir war es unverständlich, dass wir in dieser Schlammwüste wochenlang gelassen wurden, ohne Kontakt nach außen.
There was neglect. The question is if it was policy. There was mistreatment. There was brutalization, unquestionably. What you've got to keep in mind here in trying to understand how decent American kids could do some of the things that were done, beating up helpless people, denying to thirsty men water when they were on a camp right on the banks of the Rhine River. Now, how does G.I. Joe do a thing like this?
Auf der linken Seite erreichen wir Königswinter. Im Hintergrund das
Today's tourists on the Rhine are told about ancient towns and castles on the way. The bland, potted history of distant times arouses but little curiosity. But the very name Remagen, a small riverside town, does stir passions, for Americans and increasingly for Germans. The ruined piers of the former Ludendorff Bridge can be seen on both sides of the river. It was across here that the first American soldiers advanced on March the 7th, 1945. A peace museum in one of the pillars of the bridge recalls that historic time. For Americans, Remagen is a place to celebrate. Crossing the bridge paved the way to the advance across Germany. For some Germans, Remagen is a place which evokes memories of an entirely different kind.
South of Cologne at Remagen, our troops made one of the most spectacular coups of the war in capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact, minutes before the Germans were to blow it up. Prisoners streamed back as our men crossed the Rhine to establish our first bridgehead on the east bank of the river. The capture of the bridge saved a costly crossing by assault boats and served our needs well until, weakened by the heavy traffic and bomb hits, it collapsed.
The breakthrough had come after a grueling winter of fighting against tough resistance. The GIs, before reaching Europe, had been fed with images of the enemy in newspapers and newsreels.
Nazi heads look normal enough on the outside, but what makes these heads different is what goes on inside. This little thinking machine specializes in perfecting methods of destruction, and it's dished up some honeys. But the most ingenious weapon that this brain has perfected is this. The Nazis developed this weapon in peacetime. The German citizen was the guinea pig. And if his right arm went up, he was certified as a member of the great master race.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and get your bottle here. The one and only Dr. Hitler's blood tonic. Every drop is guaranteed. Is your system sluggish? Try the world's most famous purge. Take home a bottle. Are you high-strung and irritable? Do you lie awake nights and worry about Armenians, Peruvians, Scandinavians, and Greeks? Try a bottle and you'll lick any foreigner in town. You know those Poles who live on Cedar Street, the Irish down on Hickory Street, the Swedes who live on Chestnut Street, the Negroes out on Maple Street. Take a bottle. You'll be amazed what you can do.
The capture of Remagen provided a sizable number of German soldiers to compare these images against. And during the next month, the numbers began to increase dramatically.
I was taken prisoner on the 14th of April 1945 in the Harz Mountains as an army officer. And from there I was sent to the Sinzing camp Remagen with a truck or by truck, and we were unloaded there on a very rainy day. And when we jumped from our trucks, we had to pass a line of guards who were waiting for us in front of the camp, American soldiers, and they drove us in the camp like cattle.
By the middle of April, the number of men surrendering was exceeding all expectations. All over Germany, camps were hurriedly built to accommodate the prisoners. 1.5 million were now in American captivity. And the Wehrmacht, Germany's conscript soldiers, were giving themselves up at the rate of 30,000 per day. Those already captured were put to work constructing barbed wire compounds to contain their comrades to come. Although defeated, the German soldiers were hopeful of good treatment by their American captors.
Die amerikanischen Wachmannschaften waren außerordentlich erpicht, das hat uns ungeheuer gewundert, auf Armbanduhren. Ich habe bei einem amerikanischen Wachmann 5 oder 6 Armbanduhren gesehen. Dass die reichen Amerikaner von uns armen Deutschen noch die Armbanduhren wegnahmen, das haben wir eigentlich nie für möglich gehalten.
Far from home, the Americans comforted themselves with the latest jazz music, played over the camp's loudspeakers to the bemused Germans. Many were ill-prepared for running prison camps. In some cases, units of war-weary combat veterans found themselves guarding prisoners. And there seemed to be no end in sight.
Wir wurden geschlagen. Etwas, was wir von Amerikanern nie erwartet hätten. Alle Lanzer waren der Meinung, bei den Amerikanern wird es so sein, wie General Eisenhower in Paris und auch sonst immer gesagt hat, die Amerikaner sind eine edelmütige Nation, wir werden unsere Kriegsgefangenen, die deutschen Kriegsgefangenen, werden wir nach dem Völkerrecht behandeln. Und nun kam so etwas.
The spring of 1945 was unusually cold and wet. Prisoners arrived at Remagen to find themselves penned in a large field without shelter.
We were forced to dig holes in the muddy fields to protect us from the cold and from the rain, especially in the nights. And so we made the holes with our bare hands. Yes. And we got tins later, maybe 10 days later. And so we had a tool for digging, yes, but in the first days we had nothing but our bare hands.
Wir hatten angefangen, uns Löcher zu graben mit Händen und Büchsen, um es da hineinzulegen und so ein kleiner Wall drum zu machen. Es kam ständig ging ein Lautsprecher über die Lager. Das Eigentümliche war, der Amerikaner hat eigentlich immer eine flotte Musik im Lager gehabt. Nichts zu essen, aber Musik schallte von morgens bis in die Nacht hinein.
On the 25th of April, East met West at Torgau on the Elbe, 60 miles south of Berlin. Just 6 weeks after the crossing of Remagen Bridge, the war in Europe was virtually over. The celebrations had begun. Within a week, Hitler was dead, and the policy of the new leader, Admiral Dönitz, was that as many soldiers as possible should surrender on the Western Front, rather than give themselves up to the Russians. German soldiers were relieved to end the war in American captivity. It seemed the best option by far. In the last week of the war, the German army disappeared as a tidal wave of Wehrmacht prisoners engulfed the Allies. The whole Third Reich became a seething mass of people as surrendered Germans, as well as released prisoners of all nations, filled the roads. To hold the captured Germans, over 200 camps were put up by the Americans alone. Finally, an incredible 5 million prisoners, 70% of the total taken by the Western Allies, would be in the American camps. The biggest were along the floodplain of the Rhine River, the so-called Rhine meadow camps. Rheinberg, Remagen, Andernach, Bretzenheim. The whole valley became filled with disarmed German troops. Some kept diaries of their experiences.
Mit 5 Mann pennen wir einigermaßen in unserem Erdloch. Wir müssen bei unseren Arbeiten vor schießenden Amis ab und zu in Deckung gehen. Nächtliche Schießereien. Ein Verrückter aus unserem Cage wird am Zaun angeschossen, der zweite Verrückte während dieser kurzen Zeit der Gefangenschaft.
In the night, the camp guards sometimes shot for fun in a very low height with tracer bullets across the camp, and we had to lie very flat on the ground to avoid being hit. But not all guards did it, yes, sometimes in the night, and we saw it was really for fun.
Wer seine Notdurft verrichten musste, der musste sich an den Rand dieser Gruben stellen und dann seine Notdurft verrichten. Logisch, dass dann durch Wettereinwirkung die Grubenränder aufgeweicht wurden und Matsch war. Und dabei sind eine ganze Reihe von Kameraden reingefallen und ertrunken. In diesen Gruben, in diesen Löchern.
Well, when I was 18, I was a U.S. Army PFC, and my outfit was transferred to Andernach along the Rhine to guard German prisoners of war. This was in early April. And at that time, I saw these men in this enclosure in an open field, surrounded by barbed wire, from 50,000 to 65,000 men. And they had no tents, no blankets. Some had no coats. They were sleeping in the mud, and they were getting dysentery and eventually sleeping in their own filth. The exposure alone was enough to seriously threaten their lives.
The hygienic conditions were very bad. There were no latrines, for instance, and there were no medical assistance. And I said it's drinking water, yes, what came from the Rhine River immediately.
Wasserversorgung war katastrophal. Wir litten, wenn es heiß wurde, sehr an Durst. Man musste lange Schlange stehen, um Wasser zu bekommen. Es gab 1 oder 2 Stellen im Lager. Ich hatte überhaupt keine Übersicht über das ganze Lager. Man hatte nur seinen Cage und man sah also nur in einem bestimmten Bereich, was vorging. Aber im gesamten Lager, wie es da war, das entzog sich ganz meiner Kenntnis.
Meanwhile, the war was dragging on to its inevitable conclusion. In the last 2 weeks of the war, American planes were able to destroy targets at will in broad daylight. Allied policy was to force Germany into unconditional surrender, and much of the country lay in ruins. There was anger at the fanatical Nazi resistance which had led to this needless destruction. With no German government, the Allies would have to pick up the pieces. Some wanted to see Germany's industry dismantled forever, so that the country could never again make war. But the anger had also found a shocking new cause. As Allied troops advanced across Germany in April 1945, the extent of Nazi savagery had started to become apparent. Scenes of unimaginable brutality were uncovered in concentration camps, such as Buchenwald. Scenes which filled the troops, and soon the rest of civilization, with the deepest horror and disgust. Scenes the world would never forget, and would forever associate with Nazi Germany. On April the 26th, Universal Newsreel brought this story to American audiences as Nazi murder mills.
Thousands of German captured Yanks were snatched from slow, lingering death as Nazi prisoners when our armies fanned out over the Reich. Starved, many of them captives only since December, yet 40 to 90 pounds thinner, they receive a light, nourishing broth first, and ugly, unattended wounds are dressed as the first step in nursing them back to health. Medical officers marvel that some of the freed men were still alive. Heroes such as Private Richard Mulder of Lincoln, Nebraska. Yes, this is what the Nazis did to our men whom they captured. The murder mill at Ohrdruf brings out the full horror and bestiality of the Nazi scum. And General Eisenhower, a man hardened by the blood and shock of war, seems appalled at these unbelievable sights. Accompanied by General Bradley on his revolting mission, and also by General Patton, hard-boiled...
Ike made Patton come and visit the first camp that was uncovered with him, and Patton went off and he was sick. You know, Mr. Tough Guy, Mr. War himself, he couldn't take the sight of it. There's some photographs of Ike examining that camp. He made the mayor of the nearby town come out and look. And the mayor went back that night and hanged himself. Now, our political leaders knew about the camps. It's a myth that nobody knew about the camps until they were uncovered by liberating troops. The world Jewish community had managed to get evidence into Churchill's hands, into Roosevelt's hands. The governments knew, but the troops didn't, and the generals didn't. And there was genuine shock, horror, dismay.
The depiction of the Germans hitherto as decent people duped by the Nazis was shattered by the discovery of the death camps. Germans were deemed to be collectively guilty for Nazi crimes.
The problem now is future peace. That is your job in Germany. By your conduct and attitude while on guard inside Germany, you can lay the groundwork of a peace that could last forever. Or just the opposite. You could lay the groundwork for a new war to come. And just as American soldiers had to do this job 26 years ago, so other American soldiers, your sons, might have to do it again another 20-odd years from now. Germany today appears to be beaten. Hitler, out. Swastikas, gone. Nazi propaganda, off the air. Concentration camps, empty. You'll see ruins. You'll see flowers. You'll see some mighty pretty scenery. Don't let it fool you. You are in enemy country. Be alert, suspicious of everyone. Take no chances. You are up against something more than tourist scenery. You are up against German history. It isn't good. They believe they were born to be masters, that we are inferiors, designed to be their slaves. They may deny it now, but they believe it, and will try to prove it again. Don't argue with them. Don't try to change their point of view. You are not being sent into Germany as educators. You are soldiers on guard. You will observe their local laws, respect their customs and religion, and you will respect their property rights. You will not ridicule them. You will not argue with them. You will not be friendly. You will be aloof, watchful, and suspicious. Every German is a potential source of trouble. Therefore, there must be no fraternization with any of the German people. Fraternization means making friends. The German people are not our friends.
Die amerikanischen Wachmannschaften, die sonst kaum mit uns sprachen und wie vorhin schon erwähnt auch Sprechverbot hatten, haben laut geschrien, dass das, was wir da in den Lagern in Büderich und Rheinberg erlebten, eine Folge dessen war, was sie, die Alliierten, in Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald und anderen Konzentrationslagern erlebt hätten.
Die Amerikaner, nachdem sie die ersten KZs gesehen haben, haben ihre ganze Wut jetzt an den Soldaten ausgelassen. Die Verpflegung wurde entzogen, es wurde keine gegeben, wie schon erwähnt, 4 Tage lang gar nichts und nachher gab es also eine Wassersuppe. Es war eine Tötung durch Unachtsamkeit.
Now, anybody who had seen those camps was not going to feel very friendly toward Germans in uniforms and not make the distinction that, look, this 18 or even 15-year-old kid or this 45-year-old man in the Wehrmacht uniform had nothing to do with the SS and had nothing to do with the concentration camps. That's easy enough to say 45 years after the event, but it was awfully hard to understand that and to feel that in the spring of 1945.
On the day that news came through to the troops about the Nazi atrocities, the responsibility for running the nutrition branch of the United States Preventive Medicine Department fell to a young captain, Gerald Combs.
In came 3 generals and a full colonel and asked me, how little do we dare feed the prisoners of war and still abide by the Geneva Convention? And fortunately, having been a recent graduate student, I had taken a couple books and I was able to turn to, I think, the 2nd chapter of one of those. And it had a description of the history and the early nutrient requirements. And it mentioned Lavoisier, who sat in a chair for 24 hours and measured his energy expenditure by measuring CO2 production and oxygen uptake. And when he did that, it required 1,800 calories. And when he ate 1,800 calories and did this again, it took 200 more calories. And I showed them this book, and that's all it required. They thought I knew what I was talking about, and we did authorize 2,200 calories.
For healthy but inactive men living in the warm, the 2,200 calorie ration would have been sufficient to maintain health. But if it was cold, or if the prisoners were unhealthy, or if this level was not maintained, it could lead to problems of malnutrition.
They were stressed very strongly that they wanted to abide by the Geneva Convention because they didn't want to do what the Germans had done. But they didn't want to give them a half a calorie a day extra if they could possibly find out what to do.
We had issues of the Stars and Stripes, which showed the concentration camps, and there was a lot of hatred. And so I realized there was no point in protesting from the standpoint of pity or anything of the sort. And so I simply kept insisting, though, couldn't we, be a little more generous, And I was told that they were following orders from higher up. These were strict rations for the German prisoners, and that was it.
Unter dem 2.5. Der Magen knurrt. Als Verpflegung wird eine Ölsardine und ca. 20 Gramm Käse ausgegeben. Überlegungen, wie man zu etwas zu essen warm kommen kann. Brennessen und Luzernwurzeln werden vorgeschlagen. Bei einer abendlichen Unterhaltung wird festgestellt, dass wir von den Russen, die wir in Deutschland in den Mülltonnen haben rumwühlen sehen, nicht mehr weit entfernt sind. Wenn hier Mülltonnen wären, wären wir längst am Wühlen.
Wir begannen in der Folgezeit Gras zu essen, also im Normalareal war sowieso nichts mehr da, das war zertrampelt und man watschte also da sozusagen. Es regnete zwischendurch Sonnenschein und watschte im Dreck. Am Rand waren noch Gras und Unkraut, das hatten wir gegessen, ich auch. Und dann bekamen die Ersten dann die aufgeschwollenen Gesichter, aufgeschwollene Beine, das war die Wasserödeme oder wie man das nennen mag.
The thing that shocked me the most is when I noticed they were eating grass. And I had 4 years of high school German, so I asked them why they would risk dysentery doing this. They said because they were so extremely hungry, they were trying to kill the hunger pains and are willing to risk everything to end that discomfort. They showed me a tin can which contained a thin soup, watery soup, and they were throwing the grass into that to give it some bulk. After a while, I realized these people were, getting sick and emaciated, and it wasn't long before they started dying in great numbers.
Diese Lage im Lager Büderich war zunächst eigenartig und später befremdend. Und zwar insofern, als rings um das Lager herum in Büderich große, pyramidenförmig aufgebaute Kisten mit Lebensmitteln standen. Über diese Kisten waren schwere Persennings gelegt, um die Lebensmittel vor Regen zu schützen. Wir hofften natürlich von Tag zu Tag, dass nun diese Kisten endlich geöffnet würden und wir etwas zu essen bekämen. Dies war aber nicht der Fall.
We saw from our position from the camp where we were in the entrance of the camp great stores of great boxes. I don't know if it was food or if it was ammunition, but I don't think it was ammunition, it was food, and this was stored in front of the camp. Yes, and we wondered why didn't they give us the food.
I was disturbed enough about this to protest and to begin throwing K-rations over the barbed wires to the prisoners. I received these K-rations, the extra ones, from a friend who was working in the kitchen. And he showed me we had plenty of extra food. More food than I knew what to do with, as he put it.
Unter dem 9.5., erster Tag der Waffenruhe in Europa. Im Lager sind bereits 125.000 Gefangene, einschließlich Offiziere. Amtlich bekannt gegeben ist die Zahl von 50 Toten pro Tag. Über uns hinweg donnern in niedrigster Höhe die Verbände gut geflogener amerikanischer Flugzeuge rein auf, rein ab.
People die there, but I cannot say how many people died in the whole camp, because I could only overlook a relatively small part of the camp. Maybe it was less than a quarter of the whole camp, and in this area I could overlook in the days of end April and beginning of May, approximately 10 to 20 dead PWs were brought to the fencing. And every day there was a burial command with trucks, which consisted of POWs, around the fencing with the trucks, and the dead POWs were loaded on the trucks in this time. And so my estimation is that the number of maybe 100 POWs per day could be correct.
Each morning there'd be a roll call, essentially what you might say is a prisoner check, and you sort of knew that there were incidents in the camp itself, and occasionally there'd be some deaths within the camp during the night, and we'd essentially have to, in each of the particular pens within the camp, they would bring out those that had expired during the night, and during the morning they'd be removed to a burial site.
In most cases, they died from infectious diseases. That means from typhoid fever or dysentery. Others died from the wounds of the war. Others died from hunger. Others came sick in the camp because the Americans caught all people who had a uniform. And so in my area, there were some, we cannot say soldiers, some people, for instance, from the fire brigade or from the railway company, from the Reichsbahn, yes, they were caught in and brought into the camp. We had some young boys in our area from about 13, 14 years old. Maybe they were caught because the Americans thought they came from the werewolf organization.
Ich bin im Jugendcamp gewesen, in dem man am besten die Ergebnisse der Jugenderziehung durch die Hitlerjugend erkennen kann. Ein erschütterndes Bild dieser hungernden und frierenden Garde zusammengetriebener junger Menschen. Jugend kann unter diesen Umständen nicht von Jugend geführt werden. Ich habe über die gesamte Zeit meiner Gefangenschaft auf Zetteln, auf Toilettenpapier oder anderen Dingen, die eben zugänglich waren, Tagebuch geführt und habe diese Zettel sofort umgeschrieben, als ich im November 1945 in die englische Zone nach Cuxhaven entlassen wurde, in dieses Tagebuch, was ich hier vor mir liegen habe.
By the end of 1945, most prisoners had been discharged or sent to France as labor. But it wasn't until 1947 that the last prisoners of war were released by the Americans.
Insgesamt wurden seit Mai 1945 in den Lagern Dachau, Regensburg und Bad Aibling über 460.000 deutsche Kriegsgefangene entlassen.
For most Germans, after 1945, the war was something to forget. People instead looked forward and began to rebuild their now divided country. At Remagen's annual Rhine Festival, today's main talking point is economic and political reunification. But as Germany considers its future, people are also re-examining their past. For other countries, anxieties about German intentions are again on the agenda. "45 years on, German domination is to some still a threat. But with the passing of time has come a confidence within Germany to speak out openly about their wartime experiences, whether as aggressors or as victims. And while Remagen's Bridge is the place of interest for visiting Americans, the long-forgotten events in the nearby prison camp are more important to the German visitors.
Vielen Dank, Herr Schupp, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Mitbürger von Remagen, vor allen Dingen aber liebe Gäste aus der Schwebebahnstadt, aus Wuppertal und Elberfeld und Barmen und wo Sie halt herkommen.
It was while trying to finance a museum at the ruined bridge that Remagen's mayor became aware of the strength of feeling about the former prison camp.
Dann kamen immer wieder auch ehemalige deutsche Soldaten und erkundigten sich natürlich, wenn sie durch das Museum gingen und die Geschichte der Brücke hörten, warum haben sie eine deutsche und eine amerikanische Flagge auf den Türmen, aber sagen nichts über das Kriegsgefangenenlager. Und dieses Thema war für mich viele Jahre tabu.
After an appeal for information, letters poured in from all over Germany from former inmates of the Remagen camp, describing their experiences.
Und wir konnten dann anfangen, in der Landkarte der Stadt Remagen das Areal abzugrenzen. Und dieses gelb eingefriedete Areal ist also das Lager gewesen. Hier gab es ein Frauenlager, was man anfangs auch nicht wusste, wo nur Frauen interniert waren. Es sind wahrscheinlich mehr als 1,5 Millionen deutsche Soldaten im Laufe der Monate in diesem Lager gewesen. Die höchste Belegung hat gelegen zwischen 135.000 und 150.000 Personen an einem einzigen Tag. Und in der ersten Zeit war es grässlich. Es gab kein Wasser, es gab keine Toiletten, es gab kein Haus, es gab kein Zelt. Und das ist auch der Grund, warum wir eine so ganz offene Kapelle gebaut haben. Und es sind weit über 1200 Personen nach Beendigung des Krieges in diesem Lager gestorben.
Outside Germany, the story of the camps was little known until a Canadian author, James Back, suggested in 1989 that the scale of the problem had been much bigger than anyone had suspected.
Well, in the book I say that certainly 800,000 died, probably 900,000 died, and very likely about 1 million Since the book has been published, however, I have reason to believe from a little bit of new evidence that the figure is probably a little higher than 1 million.
Back's allegations were also published in a Canadian magazine under the heading Eisenhower's Death Camps. Subsequently, his book has been published in Germany as The Planned Death, in France, and now in Britain. Many historians have reacted with disbelief to Back's claims. One person drawn into the controversy was American historian and Eisenhower biographer Stephen Ambrose.
I was disturbed enough by what Bach had told me and by some of the evidence that he had sent me that I did quite a lot of investigating of my own on the story and learned that he has indeed made a major discovery here, that there was shocking mistreatment of German POWs, and these weren't SS, these weren't war criminals, these were ordinary German kids that were conscripts into the Wehrmacht, and they were brutally mistreated, in fact, in many cases. There's no excuse for it. It's understandable, considering the conditions in the spring of 1945 and what the GIs who were guarding these men had seen. But the gross figures, two things that really disturbed me were the gross figures, this million dead, and the assertion that he insisted on that this was a policy matter, that General Eisenhower deliberately set out to punish the Germans by starving them to death.
James Back's allegations stemmed in part from documents he'd found that gave details of prisoner numbers in 1945.
In the American archives at Washington, in the Modern Military Records section, I found the category Other Losses, which showed a very large number of prisoners, in this case over 250,000, for a brief period of time, some 9 weeks in the summer of 1945, who were simply unaccounted for in the system, but were plainly lost to the system, because that's what the title of the column implies, Other Losses.
Reports in the National Archives showed the changing picture of prisoner numbers. A starting balance, gains, discharges, transfers, and an enigmatic column, Other Losses. Back traced a Colonel Lorben, one of the men named on the distribution list, and asked him to explain.
When we came to Other Losses, he said it means deaths and escapes. And I said, how many escapes? 10%? And he said, oh no, much, much less than that. And I said, 2%? And he said, no, far fewer. And when I found the true escape figure in other sections of the United States Army Military Archives, it showed that Colonel Lorben was quite right, that the true escape figure was less than half of 1%.
When I was questioned about it, I said, deaths and escapes, there's nothing left. But I was mistaken. I learned from the military historical division in the Pentagon that there were many, many thousands of transfers of prisoners of war from one American command to another American command, which incorrectly increased the number of other losses for that day. And if that was going on every day, that's an awful lot of people.
I've now looked at the records that he has studied, and I'm completely convinced that he has totally misinterpreted the record that he has looked at. He has taken this figure, Other Losses, and done some extrapolations from incomplete records and come up with this sensational figure of 1 million men starved to death, and it's absurd.
Back's second accusation concerns Eisenhower. Having crossed the Rhine, Eisenhower was worried about how he might feed millions of prisoners. He wrote to the combined chiefs of staff. The provision of rations equal to that of base troops would prove far beyond the capacity of the Allies. It is intended to treat German armed forces captured after the cessation of hostilities as disarmed German troops. Your approval is requested. On the 26th of April, the approval came. After hostilities ceased, those captured would be classed as disarmed enemy forces. About 1/3 of the 5 million prisoners in American hands were in this category. They were no longer prisoners of war, and on paper were a German, not an American responsibility.
In my own research, I've looked at the subject with Ralph Steininger of the University of Innsbruck, and our guess is that about 50,000 probably starved to death. Now, that's still a terrible thing. I mean, these were disarmed enemy troops in our custody. They were our responsibility, and they starved. Now, that's not... Well, I want to be careful about this. They starved. They did not starve as a result of policy. They starved because there wasn't enough food available. And the heart of Bach's charge is that there was plenty of food available in Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, and that this food was deliberately withheld. And he is just absolutely wrong. There was a worldwide food shortage. It was anticipated. As early as February of 1945, Ike had been sending desperate pleas to the British and American governments to send me more food.
The American government had become worried about the availability of food in the chaos of the ruined Germany. In March, Eisenhower sent in a liaison officer behind the troops with a special brief to investigate the state of health of the population.
With my 6 teams, which we distributed in various important street corners like in Cologne and Karlsruhe and various other areas, we proceeded to take the heights and weights of the German population. And after we'd taken several thousand heights and weights, we then compared these data with American data from our insurance records and determined the fact that the Germans were in better condition weight-wise than our Americans.
Confusion about the food situation in Germany may have contributed to the shortage, and German prisoners were at the bottom of the priority list in the summer of 1945. Today, there is little physical evidence of the camps, save for the occasional simple memorial or street sign, anywhere from the Rhine to Bavaria. But James Bach's allegations created a huge revival of interest.
The reaction was tremendous here in Germany. The book had 6 editions within 5 months, and this gives you an idea how interested the general public was in Germany. It was pre-published by one of the bigger dailies here in Germany, Die Welt, and people discussed that book. It had such a big reaction because people are interested in their past, not only in their past as murderers, but also as a people which had suffered. The knowledge or the wish to know about German sufferings does not reduce German guilt, but basically people want to know what had happened if the stories are correct about the suffering of the Germans as well, and not only of non-Germans.
In this cemetery lie the bodies of many of those who died in the Remagen camp. There are some 1,200 graves here. In the entrance to the cemetery is a book with no words of introduction or explanation, just a list of the names of the dead. Almost all died after the ceasefire of May the 8th, 1945. About 50 miles south of Remagen, near the town of Bad Kreuznach, is another cemetery for those who died in the Rhine camps. In a woodland graveyard lie the bodies of 1,000 prisoners. To recognize that Germans suffered in the war is perhaps only now becoming possible outside Germany. As the Germans as a people acknowledge their own guilt, the world has gradually become more willing to consider their grief. The fate of German prisoners of war had in fact already been the subject of an official study. Beginning in 1957, a 30-member commission collected and examined hundreds of thousands of statements from former camp inmates and published 22 volumes.
Wenn James Buck sagt, dass mindestens 800.000, wenn nicht 900 oder gar 1 Million in den Lagern umgekommen seien, dann ist diese Aussage schlichtweg falsch. Sie kann nicht stimmen. Es gibt weder die Witwen noch die Vermissten dazu. Und auf alle Fälle, es ist unmöglich, eine solche Menge von Toten verschwinden zu lassen, ohne dass da 30, 40 Jahre drüber gesprochen würde. Es hat niemand behauptet, auch Buck nicht, dass alle umgekommen seien. Es hätte also immer Zeugen geben müssen.
Historians in Germany and America admit that they will have to re-examine the history of the American prisoner of war camps in the light of the recent controversy. This will include documents dealing with...
Everything else would have given the wrong perspective. Now people know about German crimes, they accept the burden and the responsibility for these crimes, but they want to know the whole picture.
This was the greatest.
is a memorial to the former Remagen prison camp. It was here in 1945 that over 1,000 German prisoners of war died in American captivity after the end of the Second World War. Today, a chapel marks that historic site.